We requested, Tracy do a song from Generation X, and he wouldn't do New Kids on the Block. So you got what you got this morning. Sorry, I was really hoping to see him, Matthew, and Drew just bust out the dance moves along with it. Also, I was horrified to watch him, Matthew, and Drew bust out the dance moves to go along with that. But hey, we're glad you're here. If you're joining us here in the room, if you're joining us online, we're glad that you're here. We are in week 3 of the series called Generations. If you've not been here for any part of it, this is a really different kind of series. If you're visiting, this isn't normally how our sermons go, but we're diving in to look a little bit at society and culture, because if you aren't aware of this, we've got really 5 generations of adults, maybe even 6. There's still some from the greatest generation around as well too, but 5 generations of adults at play in society today. And often I've found in my life that the generational gap and divide sometimes is one of the hardest divides and obstacles and walls that we have built. I remember as a kid growing up, my dad, my grandpa, how many times they would say, man, kids these days. And now in my 40s, how many times I'm saying kids these days, and it's like, now it's my turn to complain about the next generation. And those of you who are the kids we're complaining about these days, it'll be your turn soon. So just bear with it. You'll get there where you get to complain about the coming generations one day as well. Every generation does stuff a little different than the one before it, and that's okay. As we said kind of from the get-go, when it comes to the church, the fact that we're all here, the fact that we always want to invest in that next generation, whatever it is that's coming, reminds us that all of us needs each of us. That's been our tagline, our theme throughout this series, that we want to remember all the time, especially with the church. These are the generations that we've been looking at. If you've not been here for any part of it, we talked about the silent generation, the builders a couple of weeks ago. We talked about the baby boomers last week, and it was really interesting after the sermon last week. In all 3 services, people came up to me and said, you were a lot kinder to the baby boomers than we expected you to be. I said, just wait. Next week, I'll blame all of our problems on you. Welcome back. You're here. So today, what's going to happen, it's going to be kind of interesting. I'm born on a cutoff. I'm an early 80s kid. And really until a few years ago, my birth year fell into Generation X. They've actually shifted it a little bit now, as they do, as kids become teenagers and teenagers become adults and adults become a little bit older adults. They start looking more for where those lines are drawn, where the demographic changes. And so I technically fall into the millennials now, but man, I still relate a lot to Gen X. And Gen X really kind of had 2 parts of it, the earlier part, the later part, that really were pretty different. Curious, Tracy asked earlier, how many of you belong to Generation X today? You will proudly proclaim that way more than 2. Tracy's old, his eyesight's not what it used to be, so he couldn't tell that from up here. That's a boomer for you. There we go, there's one. Keep track, somebody. I want to know how many we get in here. Gen X is such an interesting and unique and dynamic generation, and really for a variety of reasons. You think about those of you who grew up in Generation X, whether you are a true Xer growing up in the 80s or early 90s, or kind of that Xennial crossover like I am growing up in the early to mid to late 90s. You think about some of the stuff that we didn't go through that the other generations did. We talked about the builders, how they were really shaped and molded by the Great Depression and World War II. And last week, the boomers really were shaped and molded by Vietnam and Watergate and all of these things that came out. Next week, we'll talk about the millennials, how they were really molded by 9/11 and everything that came after. And then a couple of weeks, we'll talk about Gen Z and how, just look at the news. Every day, there's something that's molding that generation, almost something new every day, every week. But with Gen X, there really wasn't one big major worldwide thing. It was more of a lot of little things that came along that helped to mold us. Really, as far as our country goes, it was a time period really of relative calm. So the Cold War was winding down. I remember being a kid watching the Berlin Wall get knocked down on the news with my parents one night. America had emerged as really the only clear superpower in the world, and we lived it up. The 80s and the 90s were decades of splurging and decades of growth, and technology grew. And really, maybe we saw more technological growth in those 2 decades than we had at any point in history up to that point. It was a generation that was introduced to personal cell phones. And when I say personal cell phones, I need some of you younger people in the audience to hear me out. They weren't always a computer that fit in your pocket. It was one of these. If you grew up watching Saved by the Bell like I did, you idolized Zach Morris and his phone that both was shaped like, felt like, and weighed like a brick. It was not only a communication device, it was a self-defense weapon if you needed it to be. Those were indestructible. But cell phones became more mainstream. They weren't just for the super rich or the super important. It was a generation that introduced us to personal computers and computer labs at school. Maybe you grew up playing on computer labs at school, playing this game right here. Maybe unfortunately, like me, many times you died of dysentery before you got through Colorado. In fact, I remember the only time I ever beat this game. I love this story. My wife does not. We were moving to Oregon. And in the hotel one night, I'm like, I'm going to play Oregon Trail. And I made it to Oregon. She did not. Because she can't swim, apparently, and died at the first river crossing. And somehow that was my fault. We fought about it. We're fine now for the most part. But I made it. My children did not either. I got there by myself. I'm assuming lived happily ever after. Well, I don't know. But maybe you played that game, or you played some of the other school-related games that really helped us for the first time get to learn on computers through a game. Or maybe you brought those video games into your house through an Atari, or like me growing up in the 80s, a Nintendo, the original Nintendo with great games like Super Mario Brothers or Duck Hunt or Paperboy or some of those, just to name a few. This was a generation that was fighting a whole different kind of war. It wasn't a war that was fought on the global stage on battlefields somewhere. This was a war that was being fought in our schools and in our streets and in our cities, called the war on drugs. Maybe you remember our First Lady back in the early 1980s challenging all the young school children to just say no. Or maybe you remember that commercial, that PSA that would air on Saturdays especially, aimed towards kids, where a guy held up an egg and said, "This is your brain," and then he cracks it over a hot frying pan and says, "This is your brain on drugs." Horrified me, scarred me. I couldn't eat fried eggs for like 3 days after that. But the point was across. We watched as icons of our era smoked or snorted or shot up anything they could get their hands on. We watched the crack epidemic become a new thing that swept across inner cities because it was very cheap to acquire and much more potent than its counterparts. It was a generation that just almost felt like for the first time it was starting to really gain steam and gain speed and move faster than our ability to keep up with it. It was a generation of some pretty incredible pop culture. I like to think of it like this. Gen X might have been the generation that introduced us to the savage comeback. Think about some of the great lines you got from Generation X. If somebody made fun of you, you could just throw it right back at them by saying, "Talk to the hand." Or that great line we learned from Pee Wee Herman, "I know you are, but what am I?" Or the most devastating comeback of all, "Your mama." Stopped any fight right then and there. It was a generation of some pretty incredible action movies in the theater, whether that was Top Gun or the Die Hard movies or the Terminator or whatever. It really brought that to life. We were seeing special effects in movies for the first time that at the time looked believable, today looked pretty comical. But it was a generation that brought all of that not just into the theater, but into our homes. The boomers, as we said last week, you were the first generation raised with a TV in your home. Gen X was raised with cable TV. So the options were endless, and you had some incredible, great cop shows especially. Those were a big thing in the 80s. Maybe shows like Magnum P.I. or Miami Vice, Knight Rider, or the A-Team. Or maybe you were more into the sitcoms and you loved these four ladies in South Florida that just traded jabs back and forth and had such a great time. Maybe it was Who's the Boss or Married with Children. And of course, everybody at some point in time wanted to go visit a place where everybody knew their name and hang out with Norm and Woody and Sam and trade trivia jabs with Cliff. Maybe you grew up more in the 90s and it was the shows there like The Simpsons or Seinfeld or Home Improvement or The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. We had all these incredible shows that were just coming, and the options were almost endless. On all these shows, we were starting to get this new marketing campaign that came out that really was geared right towards us, telling us everything could be all about us. And suddenly we were getting athletes and celebrities endorsing things for the first time and kind of transcending just the game they played to becoming iconic in their status. Maybe you remember this company you probably hadn't heard of called Nike. They introduced this shoe with a very charismatic young basketball player in the 1980s that became a worldwide phenom, and it still is, to this day, one of the hardest and most expensive shoes to get your hands on. But we were told if we wore these and we drank Gatorade that we could be like Mike, and that you could fly and you could dunk and you could shoot and you could do all of these things. And let me tell you, for a 5'9" white kid from Oklahoma, that's false advertising. It didn't work that way. Okay, at least not for me. Maybe for some other people. Maybe it was genetics. I don't know. But, it didn't quite work that way. But it was advertising that was telling us we could have what we wanted because it was all about us. Burger King promised you could have it your way. Or maybe you remember this commercial with this brash young tennis player for a camera company of all things that told us image is everything. That was really what we were being fed in Gen X in the 80s and in the 90s. It was all about us. We saw music change and transform in this generation. Now, a lot of you boomers will stand here and argue to the death that rock and roll died in the 1970s. But that gave way to some very diverse and very eclectic music tastes that came through Gen X. The pop and punk culture ushered in this new cable channel called MTV, where for the first time you weren't just hearing music, you were seeing it. And for you younger folks in the audience, you may not believe this, but once upon a time, this actually stood for music television. Because once upon a time, they showed music. They don't anymore. It's just all sorts of random programming now. But you were introduced to pop and punk bands like the Ramones or Bad Religion. Or maybe it was the hair bands for you. You don't have to raise your hands and embarrass yourself if you were a hair band fan, but I know some of you were. And you liked Bon Jovi or Aerosmith or Def Leppard or Whitesnake. Or maybe it was, it wasn't the hair bands, it was the heavy metal bands. You liked those, bands like Metallica, AC/DC, or Iron Maiden. Or you grew up more in the back end of Gen X and it was a different kind of heavy metal with some bands like Nine Inch Nails or Limp Bizkit or Korn. There was this new form of music that emerged from the West Coast that really horrified a lot of people called gangster rap. Came out with groups like NWA and artists like Snoop Dogg and Tupac and Notorious B.I.G. Very graphic and realistic lyrics depicting what life was like for them with such things as drug use and murder and interactions with the police. Later, Gen X saw the rise of pop music and boy bands, things from Mariah Carey and Whitney Houston to Britney Spears, from New Kids on the Block to the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC. We didn't always make the best choices, okay? Just bear with us on some of those. We can't be held responsible for some of the music that came out of our generation. But the pop and punk culture of the 80s gave way to this new rise in music in the 90s called grunge or alternative rock. This new wave of rock and roll that came through with really good sounds and good music, but really dark and disturbing lyrics. Bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains or Soundgarden. They sang songs with themes in them about such things as social alienation or self-doubt or abuse, betrayal, addiction, emotional isolation, and psychological trauma. It was very indicative of where especially a lot of the later Gen Xers found themselves so often. In the midst of this, we watched as so many of the icons of the music of our era, starting here with Kurt Cobain of Nirvana, killed himself because of addictions to various drugs and just this spot of hopelessness, this spot of pressure that he couldn't fulfill. We watched some of the hip hop stars kill each other on turf wars and gang wars. And it just left us with a lot of questions trying to figure out what was next. What came next was maybe the darkest part of all for especially the later part of Gen X. Last week we talked about this great festival that sums up the boomer culture, especially the movement of the 60s called Woodstock. They decided to recreate that for my generation in the 90s. On the 25th anniversary in 1994, they did one and it kind of went okay. So 5 years later, a couple of the organizers of the original Woodstock decided to recreate it on a much grander scale. And they charged exorbitant prices and made all these great promises and booked every big major music act of the 1990s to be there. MTV promoted it. It was going to be this great thing until they got there and had a lot of unmet promises. and a lot of overpriced things and bad weather and no restrooms and no shower facilities. And the people were locked in basically. And the celebration that was supposed to be a celebration of music very quickly turned dark and turned into a celebration of rage. And we saw the later Gen Xers, instead of clinging to things like peace, hope, and love, stormed the stage and tore it apart and lit it on fire. And it very quickly became a festival of angst and rage and hatred. In fact, Kurt Loder, who was one of the faces of MTV in the 1990s, a voice of reason in the 80s and 90s for a lot of Gen Xers, even said this was the darkest he had ever seen. That sums up a lot of the kids that grew up, especially in the 90s. The older part of Gen X was a generation full of fun and hope and carefree times, but the latter part of it, you grew up and it was almost the opposite. It was a generation that was trying to get noticed, trying to get attention, and didn't really know how to do it. So what do? We took it out on ourselves and on each other. Titus chapter 3 kind of sums this up a little bit. It says, at one time we too were foolish, disobedient, deceived, and enslaved by all kinds of passions and pleasures. We lived in malice and envy and being hated and hating one another. And you wonder why this is a generation that grew up to be so skeptical. This was a generation that really for the first time was a generation growing up where both parents worked outside the home. Both parents would work, so Gen X kids would come home from school and just be home by themselves until their parents got home, which in some cases was not until later in the evening. It's a term we call the latchkey kids. Kids who came home with their own house key. My brother and I did this almost every day after school. It was only for a couple of hours for us, and we were both pretty much rule followers. But a lot of my friends weren't. A lot of my friends would be home until middle of the evening because their boomer dad was working a second shift or working two jobs to try and make more money for the family and try to help out more, to chase more things. It was a generation that had a lot of questions and nobody to ask them to because people weren't always at home. You couple that with some of the things that we did see that scarred us. A lot of you Gen Xers will remember this moment when you were kids. I was 4 years old, and I can still remember the images of this. We watched live on television a teacher being blasted off into outer space on a space shuttle called the Challenger. And 73 seconds later, we watched live on television as it exploded. And us as kids, like, oh, fireworks. We didn't know what happened. You older ones understood exactly what happened, probably almost immediately. That we just watched, maybe for the first time ever, we watched visually a tragedy happen right before our eyes. Or I can remember when I got into high school in the 90s and in the late 90s, especially when school shootings became a thing. Hadn't really happened before, and suddenly it did. I remember stories about one at a middle school an hour and a half away from my hometown, a place where one of my best friend's dad was a coach. I remember about the school in Arkansas, a middle school, where two boys were tired of getting picked on. So one of them pulled the fire alarm, and as everybody ran out of the school, his buddy was in the woods with his dad's hunting rifle and just started shooting. And I'll never forget the spring of 1999, my sophomore year of high school. I'm driving back to the school for soccer practice that day. And my dad calls me and asks if I had seen what happened in the school outside of Denver, at a school called Columbine, where two guys my age were socially alienated. They were picked on. They were pushed around. And they had enough. And so they killed 12 classmates and a teacher and then themselves and tried to blow the whole school up. And I remember after this happened, all the boomer parents needed somebody to blame. It's the music, it's the movies, it's the TV shows, it's all this stuff. And I don't remember anybody actually stopping and asking, hey, what's wrong? What's wrong with you guys? What's hurting? What's going on within you? I remember watching an interview once with a particular music artist, and they asked him, if you could say anything to those two boys at Columbine, what would it have been? He said, nothing. I would have just listened because somebody wasn't. We felt lost and we felt stuck, and I think a lot of, especially kids from the 90s, felt like you just really didn't know where to go with all of this. And maybe there was a line in a song that summed this up really well, sung by the Smashing Pumpkins, when they said, despite all my rage, I'm still just a rat in a cage. Kind of summed up what a lot of us felt. It's kind of like a lot of people in this generation saw everything that was going on, and the only response we could muster was, whatever. Whatever. Or maybe you've had the phrase, since then, it is what it is. It's kind of a similar thing. Whatever. We see pain and hurting, whatever. We see great things, whatever. Just didn't really know how to respond to some of it. Didn't really know what to do with any of it. We saw what was going on, and the response was simply, whatever. There's a character from the Bible that really fits that whatever mindset very, very well. A guy that probably would have fit very well into Generation X for a lot of reasons. One, because he had a very successful parent who was very accomplished, who worked very hard to get where he was. His father was a king who conquered lands for Israel, was called a man after God's own heart. But his son Solomon was anything but that. Solomon was given the opportunity, he was given privilege, he was given wealth. He had all this stuff put in his place. He was given the chance to ask for something from God. He asked for wisdom, and he was called the wisest person who ever lived. And a lot of scholars actually think he might have been the wealthiest person that's ever lived. He had everything that you could possibly want. And how does Solomon describe when he sets down to write about his life? He writes these words, Ecclesiastes 1, meaningless, meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. I don't know about you, but if I'm thumbing through the Bible looking for a book to read, and I read that as the very first line, I'm like, this is going to be riveting. I can't wait to see what happens next. Meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Translation into the 90s, whatever. Whatever. Everything's just whatever. He goes on to write this in chapter 2. I came to hate life because everything done here under the sun is so troubling. Everything is meaningless. It's like chasing the wind. I've come to hate all my hard work here on earth, for I must leave to others everything that I have earned. And who can tell whether my successors will be wise or foolish? Yet they'll control everything I've gained by my skill and hard work under the sun. How meaningless. So I gave up in despair, questioning the value of all my hard work in this world. A lot of Gen Xers just had this mentality. Whatever. You couple this with the fact that it's sandwiched in between the two largest generations our country's ever seen. The boomers, as we said last week, 76 million. The millennials, well over 70 million. Gen X was significantly less than either one of those. Maybe it's because the boomer parents that we had were too busy chasing their career, trying to get accomplished, didn't always have time to build bigger families. I don't know. Maybe they just didn't want more kids. But either way, Gen Xers are sandwiched between two of the biggest and most dynamic generations we've had. Boomers, you all feel special because of what you've accomplished. You want to be recognized as special for what you've accomplished. Millennials, you want to be recognized as special because you exist. You know, this is the graduation generation. Oh, preschool, here's your graduation. Kindergarten, here's your graduation. Yay, you. I am technically a millennial, so I'm not going too deep, but we'll get there next week, okay? So bear with us. But who recognized him as such? It was Gen X. Gen X treated him as special because Gen X felt ignored and didn't want to do that with their own kids. Gen X is sometimes called the middle child generation because you've got a lot of big dynamic personalities in the two around us, and Gen X is just kind of existing in the middle there. Maybe it's easy to see now why Gen X is such a whatever generation. So question for you, who's depressed now? Welcome to Gen X. And that doesn't describe all of Gen X, by the way. Again, I'm on the back end of it. Our part of it was a lot darker than some of the other part. But there was a lot of Gen X that was just trying to figure the world out. And they got labeled with things that might have been a little unfair, like being called slackers, being called lazy, being called, bums, or whatever they may have been. But this is a generation that has come through all of that. A generation that grew through a very dark and difficult time to grow through. Generation that right now is between the ages of about 42, and I'm not going to say it out loud, but almost 60 years old. Generation of men and women who have become grandparents. Generation of people who aren't too far from retirement age, but also still are somewhat in the prime of life. And we look at a generation like this and what all it's come through to what it's become today, it's pretty remarkable. You could describe Gen X like this. You could say it's an adaptable generation. Generation that might have been born at just the right time. I grew up without all the technology. We didn't have computers or cell phones. I actually had to memorize things. I learned how to use a map and follow directions. I learned how to use a card catalog in a library. I don't think they even exist anymore, and I learned how to use one of those. I learned the Dewey Decimal System. I'm proud of myself for that one. Like, what's that? Read a book, Google it, look it up. We learned how to tell time. We memorized phone numbers. We memorized dates. But then when I'm a teenager, we got cell phones and we got computers at home. We were young enough to really adapt and learn how to use these very, very quickly. Gen X has been described as tech savvy, but not tech dependent. It's a generation that's balanced. Generation that's balanced. We saw our boomer parents work themselves to death. In fact, the people I label as workaholics often fall into that. That's not a bad thing to be hardworking. But I know so many of my friends, they hardly ever saw their dads because they were working multiple jobs or they were traveling and they were gone all the time. So Gen X said, we're not doing that. We're going to balance it. A little better work-family balance. It's not worth a few extra bucks if my kids are never able to see me. We balanced that down a little bit. This is a generation that's selfless. Yes, we had a lot of things fed towards our egos in the 80s and 90s. That's how marketing worked back then. But a generation that has shed all of that and has answered the bell when called. When 9/11 happened, it was Gen X that responded. That's who showed up at ground zero. That's who answered the call into the military to go fight the battles in the coming years. It's a generation that's independent. They kind of had to be. If their boomer parents were both working, they had to figure things out. This is also a generation that as they figured things out, as they got into adulthood, this is when the internet really became more widely acceptable and widely used. So this is a generation that created a lot of DIY videos. Generation that's helped a lot of people learn how to do a lot of things. You could also say this is a generation that's informal. We're informal in that we're a little less formal in just structure, a little more free-flowing, a little less long-term planning, a little more informal in our relationships and our work habits. Not because we don't appreciate that, but just because we understand you don't have to be so rigid with so many things. But when it comes to the church and what the church can learn from Gen X, and emulate from Gen X, there's two more descriptions that really stick out. Kind of like we've done, I want to land on two words. Those words are relationship and significance. Gen X spent a lot of time isolated, and through isolation found pockets of community. They weren't big pockets, but they were tight pockets. Often they were groups of friends that really clung together and stuck together through thick and thin through the years because we were going through stuff together. And we've understand the value of relationships, but also one of significance. Again, it's a generation that I think a lot of times was looking for validation, looking for the opportunity to step out and lead. Didn't always get it, but we've understood as time's gone by what more and more significance is like. The church could learn two things here, relationship and significance. Here's the first real lesson the church can get from Gen X. Never neglect the importance or power of relationships. Don't neglect it. We're going to talk more about this subject here in a couple of weeks, so I'm not diving too deep here. But relationships are so valuable for us. They're so important for us. Proverbs 13, it says, walk with the wise and become wise. A companion of fools suffers harm. Now, either way here, he's talking about relationships, but specifically, he's talking about trying to find a healthy and good relationship. And what's interesting about this particular verse is if you know who wrote it, it's the same guy who years earlier said everything was meaningless, that everything was like chasing the wind. But as he got older, Solomon saw through the folly of the vanity of his youth. He saw through the folly of chasing all these things that supposedly made him important and significant, and he realized what really matters is the people around me. What really matters are those people that I'm sharing my life with. Solomon came to realize something that many Gen Xers eventually realized in time, that life was never meant to be lived alone. Life was meant to be lived in a community of people, especially a community of people with God as the center, with God as the apex. But it wasn't meant to be lived alone. You go back to the beginning of your Bible and you will read that in the beginning God creates the heavens and earth and everything in it. And then he eventually creates man. And Adam works the garden that God's created. And after a while, what does God say? It's not good for the man to be alone. So he creates a partner for him. From the beginning, it was about relationships. That's why our small group ministry is important. Brad's going to tell you more about that here in a few minutes. We're going to talk more about it in a few weeks. But as we get ready to launch small group ministry coming up here soon, don't neglect it. There's power and there's value there. And sometimes the value there is so much more than just spending time with people. It's building and pouring into something that you may not realize you need right now, but you will at some point. Because when you're with other people, you start to learn something. It's not always about how much you need them. Sometimes it's about what they need from you, and you may not realize that. You may not realize it until it's too late and you don't have it. When you're in a true relationship that is true give and take, you understand a lot more about humility. You understand more about the nature of God. Philippians 2 says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of others. Translation, it's much healthier to live when you live a life focused on other people. It's healthier emotionally, it's healthier spiritually, it's healthier communally. You could say it kind of like this: it's much more difficult to be self-absorbed when you're pouring into the life of others. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. The Son of Man came to give life and give it to the full. So as you move forward, understand the importance and the power of relationships. Here's, I think, why that's important. The second thing we get from Gen X is that everyone has significance. Everyone has significance. Maybe you've heard the old phrase, if everyone's special, no one's special. That's kind of true. If you make everything important, then nothing is important. Kind of like highlighting words on a page. When I was a sophomore in high school, we had a teacher named Mrs. Stevens, literature teacher, AP English, and she's wanting us to understand how important the stuff she's talking about is. That's what teachers do, right? And so she's already said that all of this is important. Make sure you pay attention, and tells us to highlight the important things that really stick out. My friend Kelly, she was pretty sarcastic, pretty snarky. She took that and she literally highlighted every single speck of white on her paper. The entire paper, she held it up later and was bright pink. And what are you doing? She goes, well, you said everything was important and to highlight the important things, so here it is. She didn't like that too much. I thought it was hilarious because, Kelly knew what she was doing. I highlight the whole thing. I've highlighted none of it. I've just made my paper pink now instead of white. Doesn't work that way with God. The Bible's very clear. God wants no one to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes will have eternal life. Gen X is a generation that was seeking significance, but it was seeking it in the wrong places. It was seeking significance from our boomer parents or our builder grandparents, from the world and society around us. But as a church, we need to understand our significance truly comes from God, and then through the church from each other. And if we're able to share that with other people, go back to the power of relationships. You don't neglect people. You don't leave people. Matthew 18, Jesus tells this story to his disciples, that if a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go look for the one that wandered off? And if he finds it, I tell you, he's happier about that sheep than he is about the 99 that did not wander off. And we read this, and often we read it through the lens of we are the shepherd / the 99. And that's true. As a church, we want to make sure we're finding the one who's wandered off. But here's where it gets personal. How many times have you felt like the one that's wandered off? Or felt like the one that the 99 is left? I have. I felt that a lot of times in my life, as a teenager, as a kid, as an adult. Sometimes even in ministry, you feel that way. You feel as though everybody else has just kind of moved on and forgotten you were back there. We go through this with our oldest a lot. She finds herself as the one too often. We try to remind her sometimes maybe you're actually part of the 99 that's leaving somebody else. She'll say, well, I want to be a part of this group of friends. I want to be part of them, and they don't really care. They don't really care what I have to say. Well, what about this person over here? Well, maybe this person over here needs you more than you need them. Maybe this person that you're neglecting, you're ignoring, needs you more than this group of people does. Everyone has significance. And we don't really stop and understand that until we remember that every single person that you met is somebody God created and God died and God loved and died for. We think about this. When I was teaching high school, we would have these students, and I mean, you know the type of student I'm going to talk about. Kid who doesn't try, doesn't do anything. They're just there because they have to be. And I mean, it would break my heart to hear another teacher or coach use this term on this kid, but they'd say this kid's just kind of worthless. They're just, one coach would say, you're just a waste of oxygen. But, we don't understand. This is God's child. And when God says he wants no one to perish and everyone to come to repentance, he's talking about everyone, all of us. Everyone has significance. The problem is too often we're chasing and finding our significance in the wrong places. We're looking for significance in the things that the world recognizes, things that make me happy. And maybe you've heard this line that God wants you to be holy and not happy. And I think that's true to an extent. You've got to seek his holiness. But man, if you can get those two to line up, where your happiness is found in chasing his holiness, that's where you want to be. John Piper said it like this: God's purpose to be glorified and my purpose to be satisfied are not at odds. They come together in finding my satisfaction in God. Let me ask you, church, where do you seek fulfillment? Where do you seek significance? Are you seeking it from the world, or are you seeking it from God? And when it comes to you offering satisfaction to others, you offering significance to others, are you doing that, or are you looking around going, that guy just really irritates me, really frustrates me? Just really don't want to look at that person and think that that's who God was talking about when he said that he loves the world so much. He sent his one and only son, that whoever except that guy believes in me would not perish. Gen X is a generation that came through a lot and built a lot, but they showed us something, that you can come through all that. You can get through all that nonsense and all that garbage, and you can find what you're looking for. It's often said today that Gen X is among the happiest and most fulfilled generations of the generations that play in our culture today. Because they don't get caught up in the big stuff. They just go through it, day by day, week by week, month by month. What if our church did the same? We didn't get caught up in the big stuff. We didn't let it get us down. We just embraced what the world throws our way each day. Because we know who we are, we know what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to seek and save the lost. We're supposed to go make disciples of all nations. We're supposed to be his witnesses in all that we do. I love the fact that our church has such a diversity of where we all come from and when we all come from. Because it's going to help us continue to build to that future, whatever it may be. It's going to help us to continually, boldly, radically, and unapologetically invest in the next generation to come. Let's pray. Father, we're thankful for your church. We're thankful, God, that each of us does need all of us, and each of us has something for all of us. God, we're thankful that you put into our hearts the desire for relationships, the desire to build one another up, the desire to care about each other. God, I pray that anybody who's seeking significance would find it. And God, I mean, I'll say this for myself, but for anybody else too. If I am walking by and I see somebody who's a one out there by themselves, God, I wouldn't just leave them. I would see them, I would hear them, I would notice them and bring them back to the flock. And God, those days where I'm a one, somebody would find me and bring me back. Because God, we want everybody to be together with you. We want everybody to come together with you. We're so thankful for your son. We pray in his name.